Good afternoon YouTube, my name is Psychology MVP from Psychology Multimedia. Welcome to my channel once again, where we discuss all things tech, gadgets, tutorials, reviews, etc. Today we are doing part 2 of my digital Goja Altura Flash kit unboxing. So last time we did this episode, we didn't get a chance to test the actual flash and see how to set it up. So today we're going to be doing that. We're going to be setting up the flash, see how it works, and maybe take a few snaps. So join me after this. Hey YouTubers, I'm back once again. This is your host Psychology MVP. As I mentioned before, we are gonna be taking this and then setting it up onto my Canon 1300D EOS camera. Now, I did test this out before, I must mention, and everything is fine. You know, these things arrived, they were pretty dented, the packaging, so I thought they might not work. So I did actually, after going offline, actually try to see if these things actually work, and they do work. And before I go any further, shout out to Digital Goja. Their YouTube channel is actually very, very helpful. I went through some of their videos regarding the kit and some of the things that they, and you know, how it works. And shout out to Easy. Easy, you are a genius. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have been able to figure out some of these things. And I did make a couple of mistakes in the previous video as well, in terms of like the naming conventions and what certain things do. So I will be rectifying some of those mistakes. So without any further ado, let us begin. I'm going to start off first and foremost by not really unboxing, but setting up the flash kits. Well, the trigger sets, sorry. Forgive me for my mix-up of certain words or certain terms. As I mentioned, I am not really a full-time photographer, so I'm still getting used to some of these things and what they actually called and what they mean. But then I will do my best to make sure that I do not mislead you in any way. The trigger sets. So the trigger sets, for those who are only joining us today, welcome. The trigger sets, essentially what they do is that they allow you to take or to use your flash gun, or the flash gun, that's what most people call it. They allow you to be able to fire it off from remote parts of wherever you want to be taking the picture, and then essentially without having to rely on having the flash sitting directly on the camera. So essentially this would sit here, and then you would mount your flash gun onto the receiver, and then your receiver can be placed wherever that you want, and then you will have flexibility in terms of using your flash. Now, another point of correction of which I realized once again when I was watching the Digital Goja videos was that in terms of these pins, let me just quickly open them up. These pins right here, they're called channel pins, okay? Essentially what these channel pins do, well, by pushing whichever one up or down, allows you to set your wireless signal between the trigger and the receiver to operate at a certain signal. So maybe, for example, you're operating at just bring this in, maybe let's say you're operating at channel 2, so you'll switch channel 2 on, and also here it actually does have it, let me just show you. And your receiver, they have these channels. So say now you want to operate channel 2 both on your trigger and your receiver, then you would toggle those relevant little mini switches down. Now what's the purpose of these channel switches? Say supposedly you are shooting in a wedding or an event where there's more than one photographer using trigger sets, and you don't want clashing of, you know, wireless transmissions between the trigger sets, then you would ideally then use these switches. Say now I'm using channel 1, and then, you know, the other photographer who's using similar trigger sets is also using channel 1. When I fire my flash using this trigger set, it might just end up firing his and mine, or probably his alone but not mine, you know, and then there's a mix-up. So then these channel pins are to avoid that conflict. So yeah, I just learned something new thanks to Digital Goja. Easy, you're a genius, man. So this is what these pins are. But if you are shooting alone at an event, it's best to just have none of these channel switches on. Just leave them as they are, all toggled up, and then you shouldn't have any conflicts. But other than that, that's what these little mini pins do. But then moving right along. Now, in terms of setting up these the trigger and the receiver, this little mini battery here is actually for the trigger. So I'm going to put that in. Then we close that. So now our trigger is ready. Then I'm going to do the same. These are AAA size. These came with the flash kit, but then can always buy some of your own if you don't have any AAA size batteries, any standard AAA size batteries, and then you insert 2 into your receiver, and now both your trigger and your receiver are ready to be used. How do we now set up the trigger sets to work? By default, the trigger will be powered by your camera by default. So I'm going to switch on my Canon 1300, and you know, in terms of settings, the people at Digital Goja mentioned that, you know, the recommended setting for this is f-stop 5.6. So I'm going to set that to 5.6, and they say the shutter speed ideally is 1/20th of a second. Oh yeah, it's 1/25th of a second. Okay, but then we'll get to the setting part a bit later. But okay, now I'm going to mount my, well, they actually call it transmitter, but I prefer calling it a trigger, because essentially this is what sends out the signal to trigger something else. Now, to mount this on, you need to be very gentle, you know. So we're going to mount this onto my hot shoe, and then we're going to push it in, turn the dial a bit more to just tighten it up a bit, but it is pretty tight, so I think it should be fine. So I've mounted my trigger onto my camera and nothing is happening. Well, the one way to check if these things actually work is to press the top button here. But then you see this one's only switching on, but nothing's happening here. So that means that this one is not communicating with that. So what do we do? Now I need to switch on my receiver. You can either go into camera mode or flash mode. Camera mode, it's when you want to use your receiver to trigger the camera rather than the flash. So when it's in flash mode and your flash is mounted on here, then you'll push it up. But then when you don't have your flash and this is actually mounted onto your hot shoe, then you'd switch it onto camera, and then when you press your trigger, it'll trigger this to trigger the camera to take a picture. But then we're not there yet. Actually, let me get the flash. Okay, this is my Altura Universal Flash. It is compatible with all the major DSLR camera brands, as I mentioned in my previous video, and today we're gonna try and go through also these settings as well. But let me just quickly get my batteries and switch this thing on. But any standard AA size batteries would work. Mind you, the trigger set consumes, the flash consumes a lot of battery power, so you'd want to have a lot of batteries, or ideally have rechargeable batteries when using this flash. Before I go any further, I actually wanted to clarify a little something. the last time, well, the previous video, I actually made a bit of a mistake in terms of what these little ports do. Okay, so this actual port here, it's an external power source. So this one is to, when you want to, well, let's say maybe you run out of batteries, or you need just additional power to power your flash without having to rely purely on these batteries alone, then you'll have there's a certain component or battery power component that comes with the cable that you can insert into here to use your flash on. So yeah, my mistake, and thanks to Easy once again from Digital Goja for providing the clarification, and you can buy that accessory sold separately. And then also this port here, it's they call it a PC input. Maybe not PC as in personal computer, but it's I'm not really sure what PC stands for, but this essentially, it's an old way for connecting your flash directly to your camera's input. So essentially you have a cable that would connect to this port, and then a similar port onto maybe the side of your camera. You'd be able to, also connect it there. But those are for really old or really highly advanced and more expensive models of cameras. But if you're like me and you're a beginner and you're still learning photography, chances are you'll almost never really need to use this port here. But this was just to correct my mistake from the previous video. Now, while I'm still on the topic of PC connections, I also made the mistake of misunderstanding the purpose of this particular cable. So this cable, essentially, it's a modern version of this PC connector, but then it's not really for connecting your flash. It's just for connecting your camera to a trigger set. So now if you want to trigger your camera to fire or to take a picture without having to necessarily use the shutter button physically, then you can use your trigger set to fire your flash, your camera. How do you do it? It's through this cable. So the last time I actually said this cable was for connecting to this to connect to your flash and then move your flash around while this is connected. Wrong, sorry, that was my mistake, people. So now once that is done, you can have your camera wherever that you want to be. Let's say I place this on the tripod and then I'm gonna go stand somewhere else on the other side of the room or wherever. I'll be able to take a picture by using my trigger component of my trigger set to trigger my receiver to make my camera take a picture. But before I'm able to do that, I first have to make sure that my receiver is on camera mode. So it's on camera mode. I switch it down to camera mode. Make sure that your camera is on and make sure it's in manual mode and you have all your relevant settings adjusted and everything. And then what you can do from wherever you are, if you don't need to constantly want to move your camera around, you can just, by pressing your trigger set, it'll trigger this to make your camera take a picture. So there, see, my camera has just literally taken a picture of my wall over there. Let's just go through the settings here. Once again, thanks to Digital Goja for providing the insight. So this meter over here is your power gauge. The lower, obviously when your LED highlights the lower end or the left side of it, that's the less power that is going to come out of your flash head. But then the more power you put out, the more obviously brighter spark it's going to fire, and then the more output or the more brighter your photos are going to be. So this is your power gauge. You adjust your power by pressing the minus on the left, which is to reduce power, and then the plus, which is to increase power. It's a manual increase or decrease. It doesn't do it by itself. So if you don't adjust your settings, you will find yourself with power outputs that you didn't want. So always be mindful to adjust your power of your flash before firing. Okay. okay? And then modes. Now the mode, it's just to select, there's 3 basic modes when working with this flash. There's the M, which stands for manual, and then there's the S1, which stands for slave 1, and then S2, which is for slave 2. Manual is pretty self-explanatory. You do all the bells and whistles and adjustments manually in relation with your camera and your trigger set. And then slave mode. Now I'm going to do slave modes collectively. Okay, slave modes is actually going to be related to another part that I actually got wrong in my previous video, which is on the other side here. This little panel here, it's a wireless transmission panel. It's not infrared. People, I got this wrong in the previous video. This is actually a wireless transmission panel. Now, how it correlates to slave modes is that, say now you are using your flashes wirelessly and not really using a trigger set, but you want to trigger your flash wirelessly. What would happen is then, by being in slave mode 1 or slave mode 2, your camera's inbuilt flash, or if maybe let's say you had another flash gun, second one, and it was sitting on your camera here, the spark that comes out of either the pop-up flash or the primary flash gun, when it fires, it will essentially send the spark would hit this panel, and then while it hits this panel, then it'll trigger this one to fire. So the flash gun that sits here, or your pop-up flash, which is the one here, if I press my flash button here, okay, so my flash gun, this is the flash gun. I didn't get to show this to you last time, but this is the pop-up flash. This is the flash that everybody hates, nobody wants to use, because it just, it's very limited. So now when I fire this flash, the spark will hit here, and then this one will fire. Now, what does this have to do with slave modes and master modes and whatever? Okay, anything that's on the camera, whether it be your first flash or even your pop-up flash, it's master. So anything that's within the camera, it's the master. And anything that's any other flash that's away from the camera, it's a slave. Most people don't go more than 2 slaves, because, well, I mean, why would you want to have like 10 different flashes firing off at the same time? So generally you would probably work with a maximum of 1 to 2 flashes, or even 3. When you're in slave mode, if I'm on slave mode 1 and I fire my camera, I take a picture, it's gonna send a spark and it hits this panel, and then this camera will fire. Now the person will ask, then why would you need a slave 2? A slave 2, the only difference is that now there's a common flash setting called TTL. Now TTL, essentially it means that without having to adjust your settings here manually, your camera, when you're about to take a picture, based on your settings that you'd adjust in your manual settings or your settings in the camera, it'll automatically calculate the relevant power that will be needed by your flash. So TTL is just auto for flash power. So now if I'm in TTL mode, okay, I will adjust the settings for my camera for the picture I want to take. But now I don't want to now have to think about the settings for my camera and also have to worry like, what power will I need for my flash so that it correlates with the kind of picture I want to take? Well, TTL eliminates all of that. So then what you'll end up having is that you adjust your settings for your camera to take the picture, and then your trigger or your master flash will send a TTL signal to your slave, and then your slave will automatically know the amount of power required to fire your slave flash. I hope that really makes sense. Also, another note before I forget, slave modes when using this wireless panel, these panels always have to be within line of sight, meaning that you cannot have this facing that direction, your camera face that direction. They won't hit. So the spark must always be within a line of sight to this panel, so that when it sparks off, it hits the panel, and then this would, it'll fire. So always make sure that when you're working in slave modes using just purely this without the trigger sets, these things are within line of sight. It can be at angles, but then they always have to be facing somehow. They have to be facing, the master and the slave have to be facing each other to a certain degree. Okay, all right then. So now I hope that clarifies slave mode, slave 1 and slave 2. Slave 1 is essentially just master hitting this and firing. Slave 2 is essentially master hitting this but with TTL, which is automatic power measurement gauge setting. Okay, and while we're on TTL, unfortunately guys, this particular model, or the universal model, Altura Universal Flash model, doesn't operate at TTL, so you will have to manually work this by yourself each single time. Unfortunately, for every single photo you'll take, you'll have to adjust your power accordingly, regardless of what mode that you're working in. But there's no TTL with this flash gun, unfortunately. And then in terms of the actual last button, it's test. Test is essentially just for you to test your flash to see it works. Currently it's on low power, which is the lowest power, and then when it's red, it means it's ready. And when it's green, it means after firing, it'll go green, and depending on the power that you use, it'll go green for a certain period. Obviously, if it's at full power, it'll stay green for like just under 30 seconds or more. And then if it's at lower power, it'll go from green to back to red again much quicker. So those are just things you have to keep in mind. So I've just mounted this on my receiver, but so once all your LEDs are ready, you just press the test button and then it should be able to fire. You see? So if you saw that, okay. So we know that the flash itself works. Okay. Now I'm gonna put this on now. First point of testing would be to see if the trigger sets actually trigger the fire, the flash to fire. I'm going to mount this on my receiver, tighten it up nicely, not too hard. Okay, it's nice and tight, and then I'm going to switch my receiver on to flash mode, which is by pushing it up. Okay, it fired when I switched it onto flash mode, which is just another way of testing. Now, once that is on there and it's on flash mode, I can press my trigger to test if this will fire again. So it's test. It fires. It even turns green. So at least now we know our wireless transmission from trigger to receiver to flash is perfecto. So now essentially I can mount now my trigger onto my flash stand or onto a tripod, which also has its own tripod thread here or even here. Then I can mount this onto a tripod head and then move it wherever I want to move it, and obviously adjust, twist this around wherever I want to put it. So now my wireless trigger set is ready to be used, and I can mount this now, my trigger onto my camera. So once you've mounted your trigger onto the hot shoe mount of your camera, just adjust your settings. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the recommended settings for this particular flash ideally is 1/250th of a second with an f-stop of 5.6. ISO, that's relative. And then once you have that going, then you can pretty much, you know, yeah, take your pictures anyway. I'm just gonna put this on here so it sits upright. I'm gonna face this to my wall here, and then I'm gonna take my camera, I press my shutter button, and yep, I've taken a picture. So that's the trigger set, guys. That's it. It's done. Whew. Okay, YouTube, I guess that's it. You know, so you've now officially seen how to use the Altura Universal Flash kit, including the trigger sets. I hope that was pretty informative for you. I know we got a bit stuck there, you know, but I hope you really learned a lot, as much as I did. Thanks again to Easy from Digital Goja for the lovely insight in terms of the videos. So that brings us to the end of our video. So if you really found this really helpful, so please give me a like, and also if you wanna see more future videos from this vlog, please hit the subscribe button and maybe even the notification bell. It'll give you, you know, notifications on your phone or whenever I post new videos. But today, Flash tutorial video. Now it's just time for me to go have some fun with my new little flash. Until next time, I am Psychology, the MVP from Psychology Multimedia. I hope this video was good for you as much as it was for me. And stay blessed, and I shall see you in the next video. Cheers.